California Frontier Podcast, Episode 12. The California Frontier Podcast is dedicated to helping you explore the Golden State's unique history, culture, and environment. I'm Damian and I'm your host. So today we have a special edition of the California Frontier Podcast. It's always kind of funny when the shoe is put on the other foot. And in the case with my podcast, this is what happened. I'm usually the one doing the interviewing, but recently I was contacted by Jordan Mattox. And Jordan is a junior high school teacher who's passionate about California and its history. And he has a wonderful podcast appropriately titled History of California. So he reached out to me and said, Damian, looks like you and I are doing kind of the same thing. Would you be interested in being on my podcast? And I, of course, said yes. And we had a great conversation about issues related to the transfer from Spain to Mexico in terms of dominion over California, how Latin American independence kind of got started, and how that affected California, among other things. And so I really hope that you're going to enjoy this podcast. And, of course, this time you're going to mainly be listening to my voice instead of someone else's. But if you get the chance afterwards, I would really recommend that you go over to the History of California podcast, subscribe, and listen to what he's got going on. It's great, and he's going to really dive into also issues more related to the more modern history of California, though he spent a good deal of time working on the time period that we're particularly interested in this podcast. So once again, I want to thank Jordan for giving me this opportunity. I really enjoyed talking to him, and I hope you'll enjoy our conversation.
Welcome, everybody, to the History of California podcast. I've got a special guest on today, Dr. Damian Basic.
Right?
Right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, you got it.
And we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. Our most recent podcast was about ranchos, and so we're kind of segueing into a change in government that's happening. And so I brought our guest on to kind of help us understand and make that transition well. Dr. Basic runs a website called the California Frontier Project. Is that right?
That's right, California Frontier Project.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I started that because I've been working on California, especially Spanish and Mexican California history for several years, and I had friends whose kids were in fourth grade and going to schools in California, and they would always ask me to help them with their lessons and things like that. And then, of course, I have my own children who started to get older and go into school. And so I figured that the best way to help a lot of people, was to put out information on the internet, because that's where people go to search for things. So it started that way, and I also belong to the California Missions Foundation, and every year I would go to their conferences and hear really fascinating things that I would never have guessed about the California pre-statehood era. And I just thought, wow, there's got to be a way to share this kind of information with people who didn't go to the conference and that's not in a scholarly journal, let's say. So that's how that came about, and then it's been going ever since.
Yeah, it's an amazing website, and I recommend you all visit it. It's I go there when I'm starting to explore a subject, and I see what I can find, and it's a beginning. I always say that, it's always good to start with stuff that's the most accessible before you try to dip into scholarly research or, those massive history books that, sometimes are recommended.
Right, yeah. And I kind of feel the same way, because on a lot of those things, I'm not an expert. And so to write about something is a great way for me to learn about it, right? Maybe I don't know anything about it, and I'll go look it up and study it and then write about it, and then I know.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about the transition between Spanish control of this part of North America and the War of Independence. So I hope you could give the listeners a little bit of a background. So what precipitated this War for Independence that started in the early 19th century?
Yeah, quite a few things, and I think it's good to see California, and especially the Spanish presence in California, within the bigger context of Latin America as a whole, and of course Spain within the context of Europe. It goes back almost a century, or more than a century, because for 300 years there had been one family on the throne of Spain, or direct relatives, which were the Habsburgs, who also were the leaders of what's called the Holy Roman Empire and became eventually the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in 1700, the last Spanish Habsburg king, Charles II, he dies, and he dies without an heir. And so that brings about a big struggle, of course. You know, when there's an empty throne, there's lots of people who want to take control of it. And basically the upshot is that a French family, the Bourbons, who actually to this day are still the same family that's on the throne of Spain, the Bourbon family wins out, and now you have a French family on the throne in Spain. Right, and so that means two things. One, that there's sort of a break in succession. That there's a new way of doing things. There's somebody on the throne who's not born in Spain, whose family hasn't been there for hundreds of years. And secondly, because France is the center of what we call the Enlightenment, right? This new way of thinking that really puts a lot of emphasis on human reason, right? This also introduces a new way of thinking into how the Spanish govern Latin America, govern their empire, not just Latin America. And when I say an emphasis on reason, it's not like prior to that people didn't use reason, but there's this idea that really through human reason we can really come to know just about everything. And if we apply our reason really well, that life will be very orderly and things will go much better than they have in the past. And that's when the encyclopedias start coming out, etc. So the new Spanish monarchs, the Bourbons, they introduced this way of doing things into how they govern their colonies or how they govern their empire. And the empire, the Spanish Empire, is very far-flung. So we're not just talking about Spain and Portugal. Well, Portugal is independent at this time. We're not just talking about Europe. We're talking about South America, North America, Central America. We're also talking about the Philippines, so Asia. So it's a huge, vast area. And up until this time, the way that the Habsburgs, the previous rulers of Spain, had tended to govern was, what we're going to do is, the important thing is that everybody acknowledge who's the king, who's the emperor, that the king and emperor are in Spain, and that usually there's a viceroy who's his representative. But beyond that, we pretty much let local people run things, and we pretty much try and incorporate local traditions into how things are done, because that's also a good way to keep people happy. You know, if you sort of say, look, you can keep your old village, you can keep your old, for example, with Indian people, you can keep your old village organizations, etc. But just there's this, the king is in Spain, and you have to send tribute to him, etc.
So it's kind of like a little bit like the Roman Empire in some ways, in terms of giving people autonomy and some cultural freedoms as long as they respect certain elements of control.
Yeah, I think very much so. I think, and it's not a coincidence that the Habsburg king, was the Holy Roman Emperor, right?
Yeah.
So, and it was a very paternalistic. So the model was a family, that the king as the father, and everybody else as his children. And of course, the church played a big role in that. The Catholic Church being also a model where you have the Pope and priests, bishops, etc., who function as fathers oftentimes, right? And there's that kind of model. But the Bourbons had a different way of looking at things, and they were very much about centralized authority. They were very much about, okay, we're going to think things through, and we're going to come up with the most efficient way to organize things. And that means also removing a lot of local autonomy and making sure that that the rules and regulations that come out of Madrid, say in this case, get translated into the local territories. So people start to chafe at this. And the people who most start to chafe at this way of doing things, and once again I'm talking all over Latin America, are the European descendants, especially the criollos, right? The people whose families were pretty much pure Spanish, right? And they were the ones who already had most power in society, and they sort of enjoyed this idea of not a ton of interference from the mother country, from Spain. But starting in the 1700s, there's a lot more interference, and there's a lot more suspicion from Madrid, from the capital, of people who are born in the New World. They don't. It becomes a lot harder for them to rise to the ranks of important roles in society. They'd much rather the Spanish crown at this point would much rather have somebody born in Spain send them over than trust somebody who's from the Americas at this point. So this sort of sentiment goes on, and also the other thing is the new way, this new Enlightenment way of looking at things is not so keen on the church. That before there was a lot of collaboration between the church and the crown. And there's less so, because the crown now, thinks of the church as part of the state, and it really should be following our orders. So people in the Americas who tended to be more conservative, more traditional, started to say, well, we don't like how this whole new way of looking at the church is being imposed on us. So these two things start to create a lot of unrest amongst Spanish Americans, Latin Americans, mostly from the upper classes, because they're the ones who are really care most about power, right? And people begin, and then another huge event happens, which really causes a lot of consternation in the New World, which is the expulsion of the Jesuit order. The Jesuits were a very important Catholic religious group, priests the order originated in Spain in the 16th century by a man named Ignatius of Loyola, who was an ex-soldier, became a priest, dedicated his life to spreading the gospel, spreading Catholicism. And in Latin America, in Europe, but also in Latin America, the Jesuits became very prominent as an order, especially as teachers. They founded universities. They educated a lot of students, especially the upper classes of both criollos and indigenous people. And they had missions throughout Latin America. But they began to be seen with a lot of suspicion in Europe. They began to be accused of plotting against the crowns of Europe. And at a certain point, the King of Spain ordered them expelled from Spanish from his dominions in the Americas. And this is in 1767, right? And so the Jesuits were very popular. And in fact, that's why we have Franciscan missions in California, because the Jesuits were expelled and the Franciscans were asked to take over their missions in California. So all of these things are causing a lot of frustration among the upper classes in Spanish America. And then, of course, new ideas are spreading about democracy. Not everybody believes in them, but some do. But a lot, whatever your location on the spectrum of ideology, there's a lot of frustration with Spain and how they're governing their territories in the New World. So then what happens? This upstart French general named Napoleon Bonaparte starts. Yeah, you heard of him, right?
Yeah.
A little guy who always has his hand in his shirt.
Yep.
You know, Napoleon, after the French Revolution, he becomes the most powerful general in Europe, and he's taking over huge swaths of territory in Europe. And in 1808, his armies go into Portugal, and along the way, they stop in Spain and occupy Spain. And the Spanish royal family is forced to flee, and Napoleon installs his brother Joseph on the throne, right? And if you go to Madrid, you know there's a big neon billboard for Tío Pepe brandy, and that's in honor of jokingly in honor of Joseph Jose Bonaparte, Pepe, his brother. And so so then people in the Americas are thinking, okay, so the King of Spain is now in exile. We've got an invader. We've got Napoleon occupying the country. What are we going to do? Are we going to fight for Spain? Spain is occupied. Or is this now the time to make a move and really assert independence? And that's really what starts to happen, is that all over Latin America, independence movements spring up, including in Mexico. And, between 1810 and 1820, you have all of these what were territories of the Spanish crown now breaking off under generals like Simón Bolívar or Miguel de San Martin down in the south, down in the south of Southern Cone, South America. And to make a long story short, by the time Napoleon is defeated and the King of Spain is allowed to return in 1814, people have moved on in Latin America. And not only that, but the King of Spain, when he does return, Fernando VII, who people were really looking forward to be this new forward-thinking ruler, he comes back and he really, when he returns, he very much represses the movements both in Spain toward more democracy and in Latin America. And that's what really pushes things to war. And like I said, by 1820, 21, Spain is not able to defeat these insurrections. Latin America is too far away. The upper classes of Spanish America have decided that independence is the way we want to go, and there are different reasons that different groups have, but they're all kind of united in the fact that they don't want to remain as part of Spain, which is also interesting because indigenous people, for the most part, tend to be loyal to the King of Spain, tend to want to maintain the traditional system.
That seems, of course, like a really strong parallel with, if we think about kind of the American Revolution with the English colonies, and thinking about the revolution in terms of these, who originated it and what ideas were being promulgated, and kind of the upper classes really pushing for something. Do you see a lot of similarities between the Mexican War for Independence and the American Revolutionary War?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, since in Latin America, the wars for independence are later, and they definitely look to people like Washington as models, right? In fact, there's a famous essay by Montalvo, a Chilean writer, about Washington and Bolivar, who was the big liberator of South America, and how those two are very similar but had very different circumstances to deal with. Of course, Mexico is its own particular situation, because the beginnings of Mexican independence start with this priest, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, right, in Guanajuato, who very much leads an indigenous revolt. Most of his people, most of his soldiers are indigenous people from the area. And of course, that rebellion is eventually crushed. But the idea of independence, after 1810, the idea of independence in Mexico is still very strong. And of course, other leaders come up later to take his place. And once again, by 1821, there's a new government in Mexico, but it's a very conservative one. Also, though, the man who winds up, also like in Latin America, the man who winds up emerges as the leader of Mexican independence is a general named Miguel Iturbide, and he's very conservative. What he wants to see, and his supporters want to see, Mexico as an empire, as a monarchy that's connected to Spain, maybe like as a sister, but that's independent. And the Catholicism is established as the religion of Mexico, and it's very much a very traditional leaning government. But he doesn't last long, and over the next few years, Mexico becomes a republic, a federal republic that goes in a much different direction than Iturbide wanted to go in.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of, that's another question we're going to talk about is the changes that happen after independence. I mean, we'll get to in a later podcast talking about secularization and the mission system, but can you maybe just introduce us to that topic and how things start to change after independence?
Sure. Well, there's a lag time too, and now if we talk about California, right? There's a lag time of 1 or 2 years before news gets north, right? Yeah. So people are going about, and remember, California, Alta California, Baja California, these are the far northern provinces. So it's the frontier. So people are off, and it's very sparsely populated. So people aren't paying a lot of attention to what's going on in Mexico, other than the fact that in 1810, because of the insurrection and the state of civil war that's happening in Mexico, funds are cut off to help support the missions and support the presidios. So the thing that really hits people where it hurts is the fact that supplies aren't coming in from Mexico. And that's one thing that people often get wrong, is that supplies didn't come to California from Spain. They came up from Mexico. And so if Mexico was in turmoil, then supplies weren't coming. And so that's when you have the beginnings of sort of this black market, and American ships out of Boston would come around the Horn, and sell, both buy and sell goods in California. And that's how people got by, right? Mm-hmm. And then the labor situation at the missions and the presidios gets much more difficult, because Now the missions are asked to support the presidios because the presidios weren't self-sufficient. It's a military fort, and some of the soldiers that lived there grew their own food, but it just wasn't enough. So now the missions have to supply materials, and that's when you start getting a lot of indigenous rebellions, right? Because the workload becomes much heavier, and Native people become much more, much more resentful about all of the work that they have to do. So yeah, but in 1821-22, the news finally gets to Alta California that it's now part of Mexico. And that causes a big division in society, several divisions. One is because the priests of the missions were, by and large, almost 99% having been born in Spain, right? So they didn't recognize the new Mexican government as legitimate. And so they held back. Most of them wouldn't take the oath to the new Mexican government. And then the local people, the local Hispanic people, right, looked on it with suspicion as well, because they'd always been sort of the poor younger brothers way off in the hinterlands, and so they didn't know what to think of this new government. And then eventually what begins happening is exactly the Mexican Parliament passes laws saying, if you're not Mexican, i.e. if you are not born in Mexico, you need to leave the country. Now, there's a big history surrounding, passing laws and then actually enforcing them, right? So they passed a lot of laws. They weren't always enforced. But in California, especially in Northern California, many of the Franciscan priests, the Spanish Franciscan priests, left, went back to Spain. And so Mexican-born priests, Franciscan priests, were sent to take their place. And Mexican-born governors were sent to Alta California. And so with time, that also caused a lot of friction. And the Congress in Mexico began to start investigating laws and passing laws about the missions, because the original idea of the missions, the idea of the missions was always that they were a temporary institution. And all over Latin America this had happened. Missions would eventually become towns. And the mission church became the town church. And the Franciscan priest went away and a parish priest would come. And so the idea was that the Indian people there would then control that land. It didn't always happen so smoothly, but that's the general pattern. And so the Mexican Parliament decided, or Congress decided, that we've had missions in Alta California for 25 odd years, and it's time. It's time to turn them into pueblos. And then they started passing those laws. There was a lot of resistance in Alta California to that, both from the Franciscans, who said, well, the Indians aren't ready, and from the local people who also kind of said the same thing. But by the mid-1830s, the government in Mexico had decided, we're not going to push this off any longer. So 1833 and into 1834 was really the beginning of, okay, we're going to change the mission system. We're going to secularize it, is the term.
Yes. Well, it seems like you could maybe confuse it a little bit if you make it a purely theological conversation about, but what you're describing is kind of the natural process that was going to happen anyway, and they're just accelerating it because of the need for these communities to be self-sustaining. Is that kind of what you're describing?
Yeah. To be fair, throughout Latin America, to be fair, the Spanish government had also wanted to do the same thing, but they had never really been able to. And so the Mexican government decided, yeah, we're gonna do this because this was the plan all along. Okay. And then the question, of course, was, well, is the situation ripe? Is this the right time to do it? Are the native people ready? And that's how the Franciscans sort of answered. They said, well, they're not ready yet. They're not ready to govern themselves.
Yes, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've had quite a few episodes talking about different native groups in different regions of California, and they'd been doing it okay for a while by then. But we're not here to judge. We're just here to tell the story,
right?
Ultimately,
right.
And so on that note, I've kind of structured this story to kind of look at these different epochs, these different periods. I mean, you've got the period of large mammals before indigenous people arrive across the land bridge, and then you've got this indigenous period where these travelers are controlling the environment, and then you have the Spanish period, and now we're transitioning into the Mexican period. But as a kind of a way to add some punctuation to this period, why do you think it's important to understand the Spanish history in Alta California for your average listener? Why do you think this part of, why don't you just start at why don't you just start at the end of the Mexican-American War and just start there? Why is it important to study the beginnings?
Yeah, well, I think, it goes back to two things. The first is the old adage, those who don't understand history are cursed to repeat it. Because when you really look at the Spanish history of California, a lot of the dynamics that we experience now were there, in the sense that it was a multicultural society. It wasn't just Spaniards and Indians, let's say, but the very people who were called Spaniards, who came north from what is today Mexico, were mixed ethnicity people. Not only that, but you had constant back and forth with Asia, with the Pacific. So you had the Manila Galleon that went to the Philippines, to China, to Japan, and back. And you also had Asian people on those vessels coming and even living in California. So trade with Asia was always big, and the Asian element, as it still is. You had, like I said, a multiracial society. You had all of the climatic things that we deal with: fires, droughts, earthquakes. All of these things California has been dealing with for forever. So, when we have a big earthquake, we have a big drought, we have, disruptions, it's good to look back and say, wow, this was happening 200 years ago. Or when we think about immigration, and we think how California has been a corridor of human migration for centuries, well, even before the Spanish, for maybe millennia, north and south. And then, on a simpler level, it just helps us to understand where we are. So I live, I was living in a town named Santa Clara. Why is it called Santa Clara? Teaching at San Jose State University. And then you realize that, well, that's a town, that's a city that's been in California since 1777. So you understand that our roots are deep. They're much deeper. And, for me, I teach at a university, has a large Latino population. And for me, it's important when I teach classes like this to show people, look, especially people whose families came here recently, or who were born in Mexico or somewhere else. Like, this is your home. You're not an alien. You're not a foreigner. This is your home. This is your place. So so yeah, I think it just gives us an understanding of the complexity and richness of what California is.
Yeah, I completely agree. I had a lot of fun researching my episode on the mission in Santa Barbara. I've got a brother that lives there, and just learning about how they dealt with their water system and how they had to retrofit their church building after a major earthquake.
Right.
I was just feeling like, well, this could have happened last week. I mean, these are the topics that we talk about today: is water and earthquakes.
Right. Exactly.
So it's almost like, things never really change, do they? We're all still talking about the same things.
Right.
I mean, that's only half true. Things have changed dramatically, but
they change, but they stay the same.
Yeah, it's the Mark Twain quote about history rhyming, right? It doesn't beat itself, but it rhymes.
Good point.
So, are there any things that you're specifically interested in California history? I mean, I know that you're interested in the early parts. What are your interests these days? What are you exploring?
Actually, the last few years, I've been really focused on the Mexican era, from 1821 on, because there's a lot written, relatively speaking, there's a lot written about the Spanish time in California, but the era when California was part of Mexico is a lot harder to get a grasp on. There's a lot less written. So I've been looking particularly at the San Jose, Santa Clara area during that time period between 1821 and up through the early years of statehood, because that's the time when those big ranchos, right, there's a huge transfer of land from Mexican Californians to Anglo-American Californians, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm working on a book right now about a woman whose family inherited, or she and her brothers and sisters inherited a big rancho in what is today Walnut Creek, and how her life evolved over several decades, because she had a fascinating life. She was married briefly to a Prussian nobleman who had come to Northern California. Then later she married an American, so she was widowed twice, and she lived through Spain, Mexico, and the U.S. So she saw it all, and she saw her land basically disappear, in a span of just a few years. So that's what I'm working on right now. That whole time period, that transfer between Mexico and the U.S. Also because I was born in my early years in the East Bay, and so that's really the area that I grew up in. So it's interesting to delve into that.
Yeah, I and no matter where you are in California, I think it's important to explore where you're from and the rich history that's oftentimes people don't know about. I mean, where I am in Fresno, there's a rich history and not a lot written about it. And but there's unending documents, unending primary sources that open up a whole world to you. And ultimately, I think I think everyone needs to invest and understand the history of their own neighborhoods, essentially. And I think
absolutely.
that could do a lot for, especially given what we're talking about these days, with our protests going on, understanding our neighborhoods and who lives there and where they come from. That's
exactly. Absolutely.
Some people we can talk about the East Bay, but some people just move into a neighborhood and, they saw some home design on Architectural Digest, and they're tearing down a 100-year-old colonial, or a bungalow that has such a rich history, and it's just
I
mean, getting
like
people
the story of
interested in
Juana
history,
Briones.
Yeah, getting people interested in history is tough, but I think when you do it, when people really get invested, and then they appreciate and cherish something that has a legacy, it has so much meaning for their lives.
I agree.
That's just the way I see it. So I want to talk about Spanish for a second, because one of my challenges in this podcast is my ineptitude with the language. So how did you learn Spanish? And do you have any? I don't want to say tips. That's not what I'm asking, but suggestions, because it would be very important if you're living in California to learn to speak Spanish.
Yeah, you should. You should be bilingual if you live in California.
Absolutely.
As somebody who I learned Spanish late in life, in my college years, really, and into my 20s. So it's definitely doable. The impetus was, my family background is Portuguese and Croatian. It's a very actually California immigrant story. So the idea of speaking other languages was there, though we weren't raised speaking Portuguese or speaking Croatian. But I heard other languages growing up. But really got me started interested in learning Spanish was I went to a new high school when I was a freshman in high school in the Napa Valley. And in the Napa Valley at that time, in the 80s, you either owned a vineyard or you worked in one. And so my father was a mailman, so I didn't really fall into either one of those categories. But the people that really became my friends when I was new in school were all children of vineyard workers, or they worked. My friend Ramiro Lopez, he and his dad and brother, they had their own business, pruning vineyards, etc. So I had all these friends who spoke Spanish, and I wanted to learn it. And so I took high school Spanish, wasn't very motivated. And I have a video on LinkedIn where I talk about, a good app is better than a bad teacher. Bad teacher can demotivate you. But
yes.
But my method is just, the cardinal rule of language acquisition is exposure, input. So input followed by practice. So the important thing is to understand why you want to learn it. So if you want to learn it to primarily speak with people, then you focus on that. You focus on finding ways to practice speaking, right, with other people. The other thing is, if you primarily want to learn it to understand, read, listen, then you do a lot of that. But to cut to the chase, I would get a phrase book, like and I mean in physical book that you carry around in your pocket, a little small phrase book that tells you how to answer the phone, those kind of little things that you don't learn. An old college textbook, grammar textbook, so you can get the basics down. And then, so you want to practice those phrases with people, and then you want to get the basics of the grammar down. Not to know it perfectly, but just to understand how things work. How you say I or you or he or she or it, and then go at it. Read a lot and watch. We're so lucky now with all the Netflix, Amazon Prime, etc. There's so many subtitled foreign movies and series you can watch. Watch those with subtitles, and then just get exposure and practice. It's like a sport too. It's like a football player who learns. You got to learn the playbook, but then you got to play a lot of games. So that's the thing. Just keeping at it.
Yeah, I see that, and I think the challenge is, some people can get stuck on their Duolingo app, or they're stuck on the whatever, and they gamify it to where it's all about getting to that level, or having it tell you you've mastered it versus actually getting out and practicing. And for me, looking dumb or sounding dumb has never been a concern. It's it's finding that time to really have that exposure. But it sounds like just getting out there and trying with people.
Yeah, because it's a muscle. If your main goal is to speak, then you got to speak. And yeah, because sometimes people don't. Other native Spanish speakers, maybe they don't want to, but you got to like convince them, hey, I really want to learn this, and then they'll do that. They'll come back at you.
So you also studied some Spanish in Spain, or you did some work in Spain?
Yeah, I went to live in Spain. I did a study abroad year in Madrid, and that was really to solidify my fluency. I got to the point where I was good, just by practicing a lot with people, taking a lot of classes and reading, etc. But I knew that if I ever wanted to go to grad school and be a professor of Spanish, I needed to get to native level. And for me, I had to jumpstart that by going and living in a place where I wasn't going to be hearing English, where I was going to be forced to speak Spanish all the time.
Well, I hope if you take anything away from this podcast, it's our challenge to learn Spanish. If you're living in California, learn Spanish. I think there'd be a lot of misunderstandings in our society that would be remedied if more of us were bilingual.
I think so. And it's never been easier, and there's never been more access than now.
Absolutely. All right. So we're going to finish this by talking about some books. So if I have a lot of people that are coming back to study of history who listen to this podcast and maybe want to explore subjects more at a deeper level than these 20 to 40 minute episodes. What are some books that you'd recommend to people that you enjoy that cover California history?
Look at my bookshelf. Just an overall, maybe you probably know this one. The overall California history, the one by Kevin Starr, I think is great. That's just a great, and he's such a good writer that he doesn't always get everything perfect, but the narrative is so engaging that you don't care.
Yes, yeah. It's those narrative historians that can be really great, like Barbara Tuchman, where because I think sometimes when people take college history classes, their professors might assign them some kind of analytical book where it's looking at, it's deconstructing political movements or whatever it is, and they're not actually getting the narrative, and so they walk away from the class not really knowing the kind of the order of events of things that happened.
Right. You need to be able to contextualize things. Just put them in their correct timeline, for example. Yeah.
What about something early California history related that you've enjoyed?
Really for me, the two books that Rosemary Beebe and Robert Sienkiewicz put together are really helpful. The first is called Lands of Promise and Despair. And those are all primary sources, but they're put together. They're selections from primary sources and original documents translated, but they're put together in a chronological order, and they have these great introductions to each of them, to each chapter. So those are wonderful. That one is wonderful. Lands of Promise and Despair, and the other one is called Testimonios, which is the first-hand accounts by women, actually, in the 19th century. The great historian Hubert Howe Bancroft sent guys around to interview surviving Californios, and all of those are in the Bancroft Library. Those oral testimonies. But Rosemary and Bob, what they did was they took selected ones, and like I said, all from women. And the reason I say that that's interesting is because you get a real picture into day-to-day life, in early California. And so those, once again, each of them has a great introduction, context, background about this person's family, and then each of them tells her story, about life in Spanish and Mexican California. Those are just great. And they're primary sources too, so you're really getting things generally, firsthand. Okay.
Well, before we go, we've already mentioned the Frontier Project, but where else can people find your work? And can you give us a timeline of when your book's coming out?
Yeah. Hopefully the book will be out in the next couple of years. Okay. I'm still researching it and writing. And then, the California Frontier Project, californiafrontier.net. You can also find me. California Frontier Project has a Facebook page. You can find me at San Jose State's faculty page, SJSU, and my name. And I also have an Instagram account that I try and keep up. But, and then finally, like you, I have a podcast, the California Frontier Project podcast, and we're just rounding out season 2 with about 10 episodes. The last couple of ones will be dropping in the next couple of weeks, and that's, in all those places, Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google Podcasts.
Yeah, I really recommend the podcast. It's one of our. I look at it as our sister podcast in this world, and we're on the same mission. And the mission is to get people interested in their state's history. So, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for interviewing me. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the California Frontier Podcast. If you liked what you heard, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, be sure to check out the California Frontier Project website at www.californiafrontier.net. If you have a question, a comment, or a suggestion, make sure and drop me a line at damian@californiafrontier.net.